Something extraordinary is unfolding in Washington right now, and it is not coming from the usual corners of the Capitol. For the first time in years, a sitting president's direct bid to expand his personal authority is being stopped not by the courts, not by the opposition party, but by members of his own. Senators who once stood in full support are now drawing lines they say they will not cross. The machinery of institutional resistance is turning slowly but unmistakably, and the collision between one man's will and the rules that govern the office he holds is no longer theoretical. It is happening right now in real time in the hallways and committee rooms of the United States Senate. If you want to understand what this moment actually means for American democracy and why it matters far beyond the next election cycle, stay until the end. And before we go any further, if you find this kind of analysis useful, please like this video and subscribe so you never miss what's coming next. So imagine this moment in the early hours of a Tuesday morning inside the Russell Senate office building. Phones are lighting up across staff desks. Aides are checking their screens twice, then a third time. Senior Republican senators are receiving calls they did not expect from colleagues who are supposed to be loyalists, from committee chairs who have spent years carefully avoiding any public break with the White House. The conversations are short, clipped, and pointed because something has shifted, not overnight. And not because of a single vote or a single statement, but because the pressure has finally reached the point where silence is no longer a safe position. And that is where the real danger for any administration always begins. Not when the opposition rises up in the streets or in the press, but when the people who are supposed to stay quiet start making phone calls instead. Because right now, a serious and sustained Senate revolt is pushing back directly against what can only be described as a coordinated presidential power bid, an attempt to consolidate authority in ways that are straining the legal and constitutional limits of what the executive office is permitted to do. And no, this is not just routine political disagreement between branches of government that have always had friction built into their relationship. This is something deeper and more structurally significant because it involves Republican senators, the president's own political base in the upper chamber, signaling that they are no longer willing to provide blanket cover for executive actions they privately believe have gone too far. And the reason this revolt matters is not simply that a few senators are frustrated or positioning themselves for future elections. It is that the institutions themselves are beginning to push back in ways that carry real procedural weight. And when that happens, when the people inside the system start to use the tools the system gave them, administrations do not respond the way they respond to outside criticism. They scramble, they recalculate, they send emissaries to Capitol Hill for conversations that never appear on any public schedule. And that is exactly what we are watching unfold right now. A White House that built its second-term strategy on the assumption of unified Republican support, discovering in real and consequential ways that the assumption was wrong. Because at the heart of this entire story is a tension that has been building since the first days of the second term. The president processes power the way a CEO processes a balance sheet, as something to be maximized, consolidated, and deployed without unnecessary friction from below or from the side. Every constraint is treated as an obstacle. Every oversight mechanism is treated as an adversary that must be managed or minimized. And for the first stretch of this term, that approach worked because the political cost of resistance was simply too high for most Republicans to pay. To break from the White House was to invite a primary challenge, to lose committee assignments, to become the target of the kind of sustained political pressure that can define a career in ways that are difficult to recover from. Silence was not just the path of least resistance. It was the rational calculation for most members of the caucus. But that calculation has started to change, and this is where the story stops being about personalities and starts being about how institutions actually function under sustained and escalating pressure. The specific trigger for the current revolt involves a series of executive actions on federal spending authority, on the scope of agency independence, and most critically, on the use of emergency declaration powers that enough Senate Republicans have now concluded go beyond what they can defend legally or politically without abandoning the institutional responsibilities they were elected to fulfill. This is not about policy disagreement in the conventional sense. Several of the senators now raising the loudest objections actually supported the underlying policy goals when they were presented through proper legislative channels. What they cannot support is the method, because the method matters more than most political commentary acknowledges in a constitutional system built specifically on the premise that no single branch should hold unchecked authority. How you do something is inseparable from the legitimacy of what you are doing. And when the White House began treating emergency declaration authority not as a tool of genuine last resort, but as a moine administrative mechanism for bypassing the congressional appropriations process, a line was crossed that enough senators felt they had to acknowledge publicly, even knowing the full political cost of doing so. And this is where understanding how power actually works becomes essential to following what is really happening here. And emergency powers are not designed to function the way this administration has been deploying them. In legal and constitutional terms, emergency authority exists to allow the executive branch to respond to genuine crisis faster than the deliberate pace of the legislative process normally permits. It is a pressure valve built into the system for exceptional circumstances, not a governing philosophy for regular use, not a shortcut available whenever the legislative path becomes complicated or slow. But when emergency declarations start covering areas that have no credible connection to any identifiable emergency, when they become the primary instrument for implementing policies that Congress has explicitly not authorized through the de-appropriations process, the entire framework of separated powers starts to bend in ways it was never designed to sustain. Republican senators on appropriations committees understand this more precisely than almost anyone outside the room, because they can see in exact detail what is being bypassed, how it is being justified, and what the long-term institutional cost of normalizing that bypass will be for every Congress and every administration, and that follows. Now, this is not the first time in American history that an administration has tested the outer limits of executive authority. That pattern goes back decades and crosses party lines without exception. What makes this moment different is not the attempt itself, but the combination of scale, speed, and institutional context. A Senate that has already been asked to accommodate more than its oversight function was designed to handle a judiciary reshaped through years of appointments that create their own downstream complications, and an oversight infrastructure that has been systematically weakened through a combination of procedural erosion and sustained political pressure applied over years. Rather than months, the machinery has been stressed before. What is different now is how many places it is under stress at the same time. 3 specific actions have become the focal points for the current Senate resistance, and understanding each of them is important to understanding why this moment feels different from previous standoffs between this president and the legislative branch. First, the use of emergency declarations to redirect funds that Congress appropriated for specific purposes toward executive priority programs that were never presented to Congress for authorization. A practice that senators from both parties recognize as a direct challenge to the power of the purse, which the Constitution places unambiguously in the legislative branch. And second, the assertion of presidential removal authority over agency heads in ways that effectively render Senate confirmation a ceremonial exercise rather than a meaningful check on executive personnel decisions, stripping from the upper chamber one of its core constitutional functions in ways that have generated serious alarm even among senators who have generally supported the administration's personnel choices. And third, a proposed restructuring of how intelligence community findings are reported to congressional oversight committees at a change that senators on both the Intelligence Committee and the Armed Services Committee have described with increasing frankness and decreasing patience as a direct attack on the oversight architecture that Congress built through decades of difficult experience. Each of these actions examined individually would generate serious concern among senators who take their institutional responsibilities seriously. Taken together as a pattern that has emerged and intensified over the course of this term, they create what several Republican senators have begun calling in sessions that are no longer entirely private, a systematic approach to executive consolidation. And patterns are more dangerous than Individual incidents in institutional terms, because patterns create precedents, and precedents do not belong to the administration that sets them. They belong to whoever comes next, to every future president of either party who will look at what was normalized here and ask why they should be bound by limits that their predecessor discarded without lasting consequence. Because this is where the thread of memory and precedent becomes impossible to ignore, and where the long view matters more than the immediate political drama. What this administration establishes as acceptable use of emergency power, the next administration will inherit as a tool it can use with even less political friction, because the argument has already been normalized. And what this Senate fails to push back on becomes established practice that future Congresses will find far harder to reverse. The senators who are now in revolt understand something the White House appears to have calculated. They would forget that their constitutional job is to serve as a functioning check on executive authority regardless of who holds the office. And for the first time in this term, enough of them have decided that the cost of abandoning that responsibility has become higher than the cost of accepting it and paying whatever political price comes with that choice. The internal conversation among Senate Republicans shifted in the past several weeks in ways that were subtle at first, but are now impossible for close observers to miss. The shift appeared first as a change in tone during committee hearings, sharper questioning, a less automatic acceptance of administration explanations that would previously have moved through without challenge. Then it appeared in floor statements that used language that sounded supportive on the surface, but contained qualifications that careful readers recognized as warning signals. And then it appeared in the briefings the committee staff were giving to reporters. Not on the record, not in ways that created immediate headlines, but in a consistent and building pattern that told a story about where the caucus conversation had genuinely moved. Behind closed doors, senior Republican senators were asking themselves a question that had not been central to the caucus discussion for years. At what point does accommodation of executive overreach become active complicity in it? That question does not have a clean answer, and it does not get asked in a vacuum. It gets asked in the context of specific requests, specific moments, and specific situations where the gap between what a senator is being asked to support and what the institution they serve was designed to do becomes too wide to bridge with carefully worded statements of general principle. And it gets asked by people who understand that the answer they give will be scrutinized not just by the White House and by voters in the next primary, but by history and by colleagues who are watching closely to see who makes a move and when. And nowhere is this institutional stress more plainly visible than in the functioning of the Senate Appropriations Committee, which has become the primary arena for the current standoff. The committee had been operating under managed tension for months, approving enough of the administration's priorities to maintain a working relationship while quietly holding back on authorizations that members consider constitutionally indefensible. That managed tension has now broken down under the weight of requests that go beyond what the framework was ever designed to absorb. Several members who had been reliably in the accommodation category have moved into active and explicit resistance, not because their underlying policy views shifted overnight, but because the specific requests arriving from the White House have moved into territory where accommodation would require them to sign off on actions they cannot reconcile with the Constitution they are sworn to uphold. What has made the current resistance particularly significant is not just its existence, but its timing and its source. These are not senators who built their careers in opposition to this president. Several of them were among his most visible early supporters. People who staked real political capital on the argument that his style of leadership, however unconventional, would produce results that justified the institutional accommodation. It required their willingness to break. Now, at this point in the term, after having made those investments, signals something more fundamental than frustration or political calculation. It signals a judgment reached, privately arrived at through accumulated experience with this administration, rather than abstract principle, that the direction of travel has moved beyond what they can follow without doing irreparable damage to the institution they were sent to Washington to serve. And as this resistance deepens and becomes more visible in the public record, the real story shifts from the specific executive actions being challenged to what the challenge itself reveals about the state of the institution. Because Republican senators do not stage revolts casually, the political infrastructure surrounding presidential loyalty in the current party is formidable. precisely constructed, and backed by resources that make the cost of resistance felt quickly and intensely when senators who understand that architecture fully decide to break anyway. When they make the calculation that the institutional damage of staying silent outweighs the political damage of speaking, it tells you something important and specific about the severity of what they believe they are being asked to accept. All of this is happening against a backdrop of a broader institutional reckoning that has been building for years and cannot be separated from this specific moment. And the Senate was designed to be the slower, more deliberate of the two legislative chambers, the place where executive excess gets examined rather than celebrated, where the long-term consequences of short-term decisions get weighed by people with enough institutional experience to understand what it costs to lose things that took generations to construct. That deliberative function has been under severe stress for years, compressed by the acceleration of political polarization. And by the way, that polarization has transformed what should be institutional loyalty into something that looks increasingly like personal party loyalty. What the current revolt signals is that the stress has reached a point where the deliberative function is reasserting itself not out of sudden idealism, but out of the practical recognition that the alternative has become too costly to sustain without doing permanent damage to the institution itself. These threads, the emergency power question, the appropriations standoff, the oversight architecture dispute, and the shifting calculations of senators who once provided reliable political cover are not separate stories that happen to be occurring at the same time. They are the same story viewed from different angles, a stress test of whether the institutional safeguards built into the American constitutional system still function when the pressure to abandon them comes from inside the government rather than from some external threat. And senators who once measured their relevance by their proximity to executive power are now measuring it by something older and more durable, by the question of what the institution will look like after their tenure is over and whether what they chose to do in this specific moment made it stronger or left it weakened for whoever comes after. And while the immediate controversy over specific executive actions continues to dominate the loudest headlines, a quieter and more structurally important pressure is building beneath the surface. Because every time the administration escalates its use of emergency authority as a routine governing tool, it inadvertently illuminates what the strategy appears most eager to outrun: the appropriations oversight, the confirmation process, the intelligence reporting requirements, and the institutional memory of senators who have served long enough to have watched what happens when those mechanisms are neglected or dismantled, and the next crisis arrives before they can be rebuilt. This brings us to why the senators themselves are uneasy in a way that goes beyond typical political friction. They can see the convergence forming, emergency authority being stretched beyond any credible definition of the word appropriations, oversight being bypassed through executive declaration, intelligence reporting chains being restructured in ways that reduce congressional visibility, and the confirmation process being made functionally irrelevant. All simultaneously, they understand they are not watching a difficult political moment with a clear ending. They are watching a systems test, one that asks in concrete and specific terms whether the institutions still function as designed when the pressure on them comes from the executive branch itself, rather than from some external challenge the branches can face together. For anyone watching this unfold, the temptation is to treat it as just another chapter in the ongoing story of partisan conflict, to frame the Senate revolt as political positioning rather than as a genuine institutional signal. But that framing misses the point entirely, because the real question here is not whether the president achieves specific short-term policy objectives. The real question is whether the system of separated powers, the architecture of checks and balances that has defined American governance for more than 2 centuries, is still capable of functioning as designed when one branch pushes hard and consistently against the outer limits of its authority. And that question does not belong to the senators and revolt alone. It belongs to every institution in the system and to every person who expects that the government they live under operates according to rules that no individual can simply set aside by deciding they are an inconvenience. The historical parallel that senior senators are quietly invoking in private conversations is not a partisan one. It predates the current political alignments entirely. Every generation of American political leadership has faced a version of the same question. Whether the institutional constraints built into the system are real limits that bind those who hold power, or whether they are suggestions that yield to whoever pushes hard enough against them. The answer has never been settled permanently. It gets re-answered generation after generation through the specific choices made by specific people in specific moments of institutional stress. What makes those choices consequential is precisely that they do not feel heroic when they are made. They feel costly, uncertain, and politically exposed. The senators currently in revolt are not doing what they are doing because it is easy. They are doing it because the alternative silence, accommodation, and the gradual normalization of executive authority that operates without meaningful check has finally become the costlier choice, because democratic systems do not protect themselves automatically or passively. They rely on people inside them who are willing to defend the rules when that defense is inconvenient, politically costly, and personally risky. And that defense, whether it is quiet or loud, procedural or public, expressed in a committee vote or stated plainly on the Senate floor, is the real story unfolding behind the headlines right now. One that will be written not by the outcomes of specific votes or the arc of any single political career, but by the cumulative weight of choices made in the moments when institutional principle meets the full and sustained force of consolidated executive pressure. And the world is watching carefully with long memories to see whether those limits still mean what they were always supposed to mean. If this breakdown of what is really happening in Washington helped give you a clearer picture of what is at stake, please hit like and subscribe, because this story is moving fast and we will be here to break it down every step of the 8.